Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Layla Latif, and I am speaking from Kenya. Having sent this pre-recorded message, unfortunately, I could not be there in person, but at least, we've got great people in the room who are going to facilitate this conversation going forward. And I want to start by genuinely acknowledging Akina Mama Africa, who are the organizers of this session. It's got a fantastic theme, financing caring economies beyond extraction. And I want to acknowledge them for centering this conversation here at the spring meetings and in this space, because the fact that we are having this conversation here inside these institutions and under this title of financing caring economies beyond extraction, I think itself is a political act, because this is where the important contributions that women have made over centuries finds expression within the understanding of the global fiscal architecture, the global financial architecture, and I think the global algorithmic architecture that we are beginning to see as part of the digital transformation that's happening globally. So I want to start off with something that might seem very basic, but is actually the foundation of everything that I'm going to say today. This is the global financial architecture. And we need to understand it very clearly before we can challenge it, right? Because GFA is the system of institutions, rules, and conventions that determines how money moves across the world, who gets it, who keeps it, who is systematically prevented from ever holding onto it. And when we speak about the IMF, the World Bank, also the sovereign debt markets, the OECD's tax standard setting machinery, bilateral investment treaties, all of this taken together, this is the architecture. And what this architecture has produced consistently and structurally is extraction, right? Which is the movement of value from the global south to the global north, from the resource rich to the capital rich, from those whose labor has built the system to those whose ownership of it the law has always protected. Now, the logic behind this extraction, we all know it did not emerge from anywhere. It is the same logic that produced colonialism. The idea that certain territories, certain peoples, certain bodies of knowledge existed to serve the accumulation of others. It is the same logic that produced racial capitalism, where the racialization of labor determined not only who would be compensated, but who would be allowed to build wealth across nations or generations. And it is the same logic that structured the patriarchal organization of finance, which is the thinking, which is even embedded in law and practice and the design of financial institutions, that women are not the proper owners of capital, that they do not control it, do not direct it, and cannot use it for further enrichment. And that toxic thinking is not historical. It is present and it has found its way into international taxation. And I know what you're thinking. Perhaps, what has tax got to do with any of this? And let me just give you a concrete example. The international tax system was built on the principle that corporations are taxed where they are headquartered, not where they generate value. So a company extracting minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo, or running a ride-hailing platform across Nairobi, pays its principal tax in London or Dublin or even, Delaware. The country where the value is actually being generated, where the workers are, where the roads are wearing out, where the hospitals are underfunded, it gets a fraction. And those rules were written in the 1920s by four economists from capital exporting countries at a time when most of Africa and Asia were under colonial administration and they had no voice in the process. The architecture, therefore, was built for extraction. And since then, it has never been rebuilt. But of course, it does not just end there. The pathways of extraction are now also being reproduced through digitalization, and they are being deepened through artificial intelligence. The problems we are describing, extraction, gendered asymmetry, colonial logic, the expansion of capital into every domain of human life. They are also now flowing through digital chains. And I want you to understand this from the specific perspective of the platform economy, because we all engage in it, we all use it, because that is where most of this extraction, bias, asymmetries becomes most visible. And I want you to think of a domestic worker in either Nairobi, Joburg, or even Lagos who's employed through a platform app. What happens is that she's then matched, she's rated, and priced by an algorithm. And the platform captures her labor and monetizes her reputation. 5 star, 3 star, 2 star, depending on how the clients view her. But when the tax authority tries to locate her in the fiscal system, right, in order to extend a social protection entitlement or to give her a pension or to recognize her as a worker, that algorithm that governs her working life says she's an independent contractor by law. Then, if she's an independent contractor, she has no employer. She belongs in the language of fiscal systems nowhere. She pays no employment tax because there is no employment relationship. She receives no maternity protection, no sick pay, no contributory pension. And the platform that profits from every job she completes bears no tax obligation in relation to her whatsoever. So she is fiscally invisible, not because she is economically inactive, but because the system was designed to see through her. Now, here is what makes this especially important. There has always been an argument, and feminist economists have made it consistently, that the care economy, which is the foundation on which every income generating economy rests, has always been left out of the social contract. The cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the elder care, the emotional labor that makes all formal economic activity possible, it was assigned to women, uncompensated, and rendered invisible by every framework that was supposed to account for economic life. And that exclusion is now showing its face in the design of the digital economy and also in the architecture of artificial intelligence. Now, to put it yani in terms that you can feel, right? The AI system is being trained on that domestic worker's behavioral data, right? Her routes, her ratings, her response times. It's generating value that is captured by a corporation that's paying no meaningful tax in the country where she lives. She is subsidizing through her labor and her data the very system that excludes her from fiscal recognition. The care economy's historic exclusion from the social contract, I think, has found a new, more efficient and more opaque institutional form in the platform economy. So, what does all of this tell us? It tells us that we need a new conceptual vocabulary to describe what is happening because the old vocabulary is not precise enough. And this is where you see on this slide certain terminologies like techno-feudalism, techno-neocolonialism, and algorithmic dispossession, which I want to explain now. So the former Minister of Finance of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, has written about techno-feudalism, the idea that we have moved from market capitalism to a cloud-based feudal order in which platform owners extract rents from populations who have no exit and no recourse. And I really find that argument very useful and that vocabulary. But for the global South context, I want to go further because what we are witnessing is techno-neocolonialism, which is also the condition in which formal political independence coexists with substantive economic subordination, which is reproduced and entrenched through digital infrastructure now rather than the previous direct territorial control. Because when you think about this cloud settings, right, it's not neutral. It is owned. it is governed by the laws and tax treaties of its owners of the cloud, like Amazon Web Services. And beneath it, it operates what I would call algorithmic dispossession, which I will define as the process by which platform design choices, tax classification systems, and digital financial infrastructure, they combine to make the labor, assets, and fiscal contributions of global South populations basically invisible to the systems that are supposed to protect and serve them. And we need to be careful because this is not happening, at the margins of the global financial architecture. It is becoming structurally embedded within it. Governments across the global south, they are offering data center incentives that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars to attract digital infrastructure investment that serves primarily non-resident corporations. Kenya, for example, is competing on incentive debt, right? Corporate tax waivers, import duty exemptions, VAT relief. We're surrendering revenue before negotiation even begins under the banner of the Silicon Savannah. And then when you look at Ireland, it demonstrates where that logic terminates. An effective tax rate on digital infrastructure investments that approaches 2 to 3% under the knowledge development box, which is a blueprint for race to the bottom incentive design that has since been adopted globally, including by the former colonies. We don't have to go far. We just also have to look at Sri Lanka, which has extended its export processing zone model to digital infrastructure. And it has granted decade-long tax holidays whose fiscal return has basically been negligible and whose employment effects have been confined to low-wage technical roles with no meaningful technology transfer. So 3 jurisdictions and 1 story. The architecture of extraction, it's reproducing itself through the very instruments that were supposed to correct it. So then the question is, where do we go from here? So there are 2 places that we could focus on. And of course, these 2 places that we're going to be focusing on, they must be pursued together. The first is through the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. And I think this matters because for the first time, the countries of the Global South are in the room as core architects of international tax rules, not as observers or, implementers of rules written elsewhere. So the convention must, and I choose that word deliberately because permissive language in international taxation is a structural gift to capital. So the convention must establish binding obligations on source taxation, on automatic exchange of financial information, on taxing digital services in a way that reflects where value is actually generated, and on gender responsive tax design as a foundational principle rather than an afterthought. So permissive language, when you have language in law that says may, the member states may choose to. That word may is permissive language. It's discretionary and it costs us. It has always cost us and we cannot afford it again. Then the second is the genuine integration of care economy analysis into everything we are designing. So in AI governance, in development finance, in tax reform, in every conversation that you're going to be having during the spring meetings this week. Tax systems that are designed without gender analysis, they're not neutral. They are by default designed for the formally employed, the propertied, the historically recognized. We need to change what we measure so that the care work appears in national accounts and therefore in our fiscal planning. We need to change what we tax so that the value generated from data and digital platforms is captured where it is produced. And we need to insist that the governance of artificial intelligence is built on feminist fiscal foundations because AI systems that are trained on care workers' data without compensation or fiscal return, they are encoding a very old injustice into a very new technology. So this architecture of extraction that we have inherited was built without us. The question I'm leaving you with is whether we will build the next one on our own terms. And what is really important is that we really need to start studying the apps that are out there to be able to understand and comprehend and even conceptualize the way in which these algorithms are beginning to profile behavior. And on the basis of that, corporations, including government entities, are beginning to formulate their policies. Because if these algorithms are going to be working in the context of gendered asymmetries, historical bias, and with the conceptualization of patriarchal finance, then we're going to simply be having this conversation continued in the next few years to come as we discuss the architecture of extraction, because the same architecture is then going to be embedded within digitalization, and that is what we need to prevent. Thank you.